If you listened to our show a couple of weeks ago, you already know that we weren't the biggest fans of Eternals. We laid out the reasons for that in our review episode. Now, most of the time, we just move on, not talk about it again, because that's what well-adjusted people do. But today, I'm going to break that rule as we look at why Eternals doesn't work. And I'm doing that with my friend Lucas Pinckard from the Reverend and the Reprobate podcast.
It's true. All of it.
What is the name of the porg on the Millennium Falcon?
Force is strong in my family.
What do you think his name is? It's a big moment.
I am a Jedi, like my father before me.
Maybe Turbis?
Do or do not. There is no try.
Turbis? Pablo, if you're listening to this live stream, that porg's name is now Turbis. It's a good Star Wars name.
We're not done yet.
These guys recorded an awesome podcast called Tatooine Sons. Everybody was
Welcome to Tatooine Sons, the only fan podcast to name an official Star Wars creature who just happened to have made an appearance yesterday in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade and be endorsed by the writer-director of The Last Jedi, Rian Johnson. We believe that pop culture is the mythology of this generation, that there is a story and it is written on our souls, and that these myths speak to that story, or at least they should speak to that story. And that is why I'm honored to be joined this week by Lucas Pinckard. Over the last 15 years, Lucas has spent time as a touring musician and evangelist and international missionary, and he is now the pastor of First Baptist Church Lake Dallas and the host of the Reverend and the Reprobate podcast. Lucas and I had a very different conversation regarding Eternals than what you've probably heard on other shows. And it all started with the question, what's the biggest reason Eternals didn't work for you?
The lack of character development. Like I really wanted to love this movie. I went into it. I've loved everything that Marvel has done, even, and maybe this is just because of Scandinavian heritage or my Thor bias, whatever it is. I even loved The Dark World. I even found there were moments, there were gems in that I could hold on to that I really enjoyed.
So you're one of like two guys in the world that like that movie?
Yeah. Me and Chris Hemsworth were the only two people that enjoyed that movie. But there were even things in there that I liked. I enjoyed the way that they set up some of the characters and especially the character arc that it did for Loki, and the way that it changed his character I thought was really great because it furthered, the main story. I didn't feel like we had any of that in the Eternals. And it wasn't because there's a lot of people I know that are knocking it for some of the extra stuff that got brought into it. And I think there's certainly an argument to be made for that. But the character development, you had 10 new characters that you introduced. You didn't develop any of them. And by the time that the characters start to die off, there was no relational continuity with them. And as the story progressed, there was no real continuity between the characters either. It's like the thousands of years that they built these relationships, that the relationships even between the characters were pretty thin, that they didn't really have the sort of affection for one another that you felt like they had in the comic books because of the way that the mythology was built around in the actual battles and things that they went through. And there didn't feel like a united enemy for them to come against. And again, if there's not a reason for us to cheer for the heroes, then that's another area in character development where it totally lacked. The character development was just so bland and vague that it prevented me from being able to really enjoy the movie itself.
Do you think that was because it was spread out over such a massive amount of time and that type of thing? Or do you think it was because they introduced so many characters at once? What was the reason that the character development didn't work for you?
It maybe it's a both and. you have this massive amount of time that it's supposed to cover, but I thought that there were moments where you really could have done something incredible with some of the characters. Gilgamesh, I thought, was one that you could have done a lot more with, especially his relationship with Thena. We see them go away. He goes to protect her, and then the next time we see them, it's hundreds of years later, and we don't know what's happened in that relationship. We haven't seen any of Thena's regression. We haven't seen what that relationship has been like. So there's some of those moments where they could have taken things in and captured stuff a little bit better. Likewise, though, there's characters like Makari, who has a wonderful story arc, and being a deaf character who is speaking beautiful ASL. She's using that language magnificently. It's a really great way to introduce the Marvel audience who is probably not familiar with ASL or with how those interactions look like into the MCU. The way that like Druig at one point, whenever they're in Babylon, I believe, is actually interpreting the ASL for the Babylonians. It's absolutely incredible. And there are these pieces that they could have done a little bit more in order to create the character. Doing it over such a vast amount of time, there are certain elements of character development that you have to either have some kind of historical knowledge and background to figure out where times have changed and all that, which definitely hurts the story. The fact that it is 10 characters and there's so many different moving pieces and the relationships between all the characters change, and they really try to shoehorn in some of that stuff is difficult. But I think the thing that really damaged the character development were the other things that they felt like this movie needed. And you sure, I posted something on our the Reverend and Reprobate Twitter account where IGN did an article on how the sex scene in The Eternals was filmed in 25 minutes, that they only had 25 minutes to film it. And Chloe, the director, talks about how the light was just perfect and it was only perfect for this 25 minutes. And they really, had to make sure that they captured it. Well, that 25 minutes that they spent shooting that and all of the time that they spent setting up that scene and the hundreds of dollars and thousands of dollars that went into that, I think the 30 seconds that was on screen, if you would have devoted that to Gilgamesh and Thena or to Makari and Druig, or to show, that Sprite left Ajax and everything that happened with that, Sprite going and kind of moving out of her way in order to be with the other characters. Those things better serve the story than, the PG-13 sex scene that they shoehorned into the thing that didn't do anything to further the story at all. It just helped them to get a rating. Those are
they
the
didn't
things.
even need it for the rating. I mean, every MCU film has been PG-13. They didn't have to have any sexual content in order to get a PG-13 rating. It was right. And we've talked about it on the show. It didn't work. It didn't have any value to the story. It didn't result in anything different happening later on in the relationship between Icarus and
Cersei.
And Cersei. Yeah. So there was no point in all of that. You've got in the Marvel comics, the Eternals are part of this larger creation story that involves this one above all, this benevolent deity. He's the source of, all love and good he's the power behind the creation of the first universe and then the multiverse. And so there's all this opportunity there with a character like that, with everything they're bringing in with the multiverse right now. But in Eternals, this deity is completely written out of the story. He's replaced by this Ereshkigal, and Ereshkigal he's deceptive. He's aloof. He's not communicating with the Eternals unless they're reaching out to him. He doesn't value humanity at all. He sees the earth as nothing more than kind of an egg to incubate another celestial. Why do you think that Marvel avoids, in the MCU at least, avoids a loving and benevolent deity?
Well, I think one of the main things is you got to look at the worldview that Disney overall comes from. And, I always feel weird about approaching these topics because it feels a little conspiratorial, when sure. you get into the whole thing of like what's really going on behind the scenes at Disney, bum. And, I watched enough videos about the Illuminati whenever I was in high school that I want to just distance away from all of that stuff. Right. So national treasure and all of that stuff aside, there are some very basic things within the way that we construct our worldview that inform absolutely everything about how we tell a story. And, Nancy Pearcey, Francis Schaeffer, and Brian Godawa, who has written a book called Hollywood Worldviews, they do a wonderful job of this. I forget the author's name. He wrote a book called The Trojan Mouse, How Disney's Winning the Culture Wars. He talks a lot about this stuff as well, is that a worldview is made up of three basic elements and sometimes a fourth, but the three basic elements are how you deal with creation, how you deal with the fall or with evil in the world, and then how you deal with redemption. You recently had a guest on your show, Stephen Kent, who talks about these things in his book, How the Force Can Fix the World. And when you're setting up, phase 4 of the MCU, we've had Captain America that makes vague references to, there's only one God, and I'm sure he doesn't dress like that. You have Mac in what I think is the non-canonized show, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., who is kind of this Paragon character who takes over as the director from Coulson. And if you haven't seen it, that's not my fault. This is spoiling things for you. So that character talks about how there is a real place, a heaven and hell. And, they're glad that their director believes in those things. So he's a Christian character within that. With the greater portion of the MCU, though, they've always held up, and Clark Gregg does this in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., but we also see it throughout the MCU, that they make it seem like gods, quote unquote, are aliens. Now, while in particular that relates to the Asgardians, being that they're from a different realm or a different planet or whatever, this is actually a very prevalent worldview within a sort of scientific rationality, that there are so many things in our world that point to intelligent design. And so in order to either explain it away, you have to say that somebody is playing with it. And one of the prevalent theories is that the person that's playing with it is an extraterrestrial, that there is an alien that is tweaking things in our world that is creating this to happen. And when you look at some of the things that Disney has done in the past and what they're doing with the Marvel movies in particular, is we're moving more towards ambiguity. And if we're able to eliminate a creator, then one of the very first things that we eliminate is moral law. We eliminate the necessity for good and evil to be some of the dominant forces in the story. And the further and further we get away from that, we get into, we talk moral ambiguity, but we also get into this sort of, what I think, what I feel, my truth, your truth, and the relative, moral world that we find ourselves in a lot of times. And I think that's one of the things that Eternals really, if they do anything, they do a great job of showing moral relativism. And the first way that you get to moral relativism is that you eliminate the need for a creator. If you eliminate the creator, or if the creator is no longer a benevolent, loving God, if the creator is, Ereshim, who has planted a seed on earth and everything is there to serve, his purpose, that we're all just cogs in this machine, then we get back to some of the very things that define the worldviews of when you're looking at rational scientism or naturalism, and even, some of the Marxist theories. They start with that we're all kind of cogs in this machine. Everything's predetermined for us. And the closer and closer you get to that, then the moral ambiguity in the stories, the choices and decisions that the characters make, they don't actually matter. And I think Eternals shows that just across the board, as there are several characters that you can eliminate and it doesn't change the storyline at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we talked about this in our review episode we did a few weeks ago when the movie came out. There doesn't seem to be any clearly defined villain in this film. You have, at the beginning, you're led to believe, and all the trailers and everything led us to believe it was the Deviants. But then we get the twist, right, that it's Icarus, but then maybe not, because he sort of comes back to the good guy thing at the end and then flies into the sun and tries to fulfill Sprite's story anyway. And then you kind of think it's ultimately, it might be Ereshim as the bad guy, but he's not, because he's just a being outside of this. Why does this ambiguity, especially as it relates to the villains, hurt this story?
Well, going back to the very first issue that I have with it is character development. One of the things that we really look for in a story is transcendence. And it is one of the, you guys talk on the Tatooine Sons is that, we believe that cinema and storytelling, that these are the modern myths. This is the reason that we talk about them. And one of the things so incredible about mythology is that all of the stories are transcendent. One of the reasons that the biblical narrative is so compelling is because it speaks to the human soul in a transcendent way, that there are things, there are forces greater and bigger than ourselves that we're fighting for, that there's this redemption story that's beautiful and can show us how we can, reconcile to God through the death of his son and his resurrection. And it's this beautiful narrative that just speaks so much to our heart. Well, when you move more and more and more towards ambiguity, you get further and further and further away from transcendence. And the further you get away from that, the less your heroes are having to fight things. The less we see them under duress. You mentioned that there is no real clear villain, and the way that the movie flows sets it up in such a way that not only is there no real clear villain, but the villain could be anybody. The good guy could be anybody. And there's a certain worldview there where it's like, oh, you can find the best and the worst of people, and any of us can be the hero. And I think that there's parts of that are great. But the damage in the story when it comes to not having something that all of the Eternals are fighting against is that in the audience point, that there is nothing really in the story that does speak to the human soul and the human heart. That there's nothing about any of this that we can connect with because it doesn't fit into the stories that are written onto our souls at all. That there's nothing that speaks to a benevolent good. There's nothing that speaks to, what it is that we can achieve. There's no redemption in the story whatsoever. And so you've got villains at some point, the deviants, which are set up that way. But if you remove the deviants from the storyline doesn't change. They try to set Icarus up as this all-powerful sort of Superman character and figure that nobody, could even have the potential to be able to battle against, and that all the Eternals talk about how afraid they are of Icarus. And even Icarus, Kingo says at one point, even Icarus couldn't stop this thing. But we really haven't seen that Icarus is all that powerful. The dialogue tells us that Icarus is powerful, but we've seen Icarus get his butt kicked 2 or 3 times during the film. So Icarus isn't even an ominous bad guy. The only real villain in this movie that's set up that way is Druig. And by the middle of the movie, he completely changes his tune. So when you have somebody that has done something, he's taken people against his will. If you were to arm everybody against Druig, now all of a sudden you've got this army of humanity. Humanity has to be saved, and the story takes a completely different turn. But with no real good guy, no real bad guy, there's nothing for us to connect with. There's no struggle for the characters other than whether or not they believe something within their own framework is morally reprehensible or not. And I mean, that's a coffee table discussion. It's not a plot for a movie.
All the great stories have a clear battle between good and evil. There are heroes, and we know who they are, and there are villains, and we know who they are. And when those lines are blurred to the extent that they are in Eternals, the story suffers, because that story inside our souls can't clearly connect with the characters and what they're fighting for. My interview with Lucas will continue in just a moment, but I want to take a minute to thank our sponsor, Cufflinks.com. Something that Lucas doesn't talk about all that much is that he's a professional bass guitarist. He has toured with some of the biggest names in pop music, and he's also a very sharp-dressed fan. The good news is that Lucas can find more than just Star Wars, Marvel, and DC accessories on Cufflinks.com. They have a ton of music-related items as well that Lucas will absolutely love. And if you're not familiar with Cufflinks.com, all you need to know is that they have over 3,000 items for the sharp-dressed fan, including cufflinks, ties, tie bars, and socks from all of the fandoms that you love, and a lot more. We love Cufflinks.com because they are family-owned and run by a couple of brothers who geek out about Star Wars as much as we do. And so if you want to look good and help out the show by doing it, you can head over to cufflinks.com, take a look at everything it has to offer. Make sure that you're doing that today. It's Black Friday. Why not use the code Tatooine15 to get some Christmas shopping done? You're going to save 15% off your order when you use that code. So make sure you take advantage of that opportunity. All right, I can definitely see Lucas wearing some of these amazing items for cufflinks.com, but maybe not Dan Lee, the Reprobate, on that show. He doesn't really like The Last Jedi, so I'm not sure he's actually cool enough to wear anything from cufflinks.com. But anyway, I digress. Ancient mythology is front and center in this film, but it feels like Sprite's stories are intended to mock humanity while entertaining the simple-minded. I asked Lucas why he thinks Marvel chose to tell the stories of the gods this way.
Again, I think this goes back to the discussion we were having about worldviews. And if you come from a naturalistic worldview, if you eliminate the need for a creator, then anybody that believes in something outside of what can be proven naturalistically is foolish in some way, shape, form, or fashion. And so throughout the story as Sprites, you get a couple of scenes where Sprite's doing this beautiful storytelling, and there's like, she's animating things in the middle of the room, and it's very, very Gandalf-esque at a few points. That naivete and that foolishness is something that is being communicated as, if you believe in this, then you are dumb. And that is very intentional within the context of the worldview that's being portrayed. And that's one of the things that I think is not only something that kind of sneaks into the story, but it's also very intentional on the part of the creators and the writers of the film, because they come from a naturalistic worldview. And when you move down that line and continue on, then anything that is not explainable, the supernatural, all of that just becomes absolute fantasy. And so the reason that they portray it that way is because there are some humans that are just too dumb to be able to realize that God doesn't exist. And so Sprite is put there in order that she can entertain them and sort of, as the Pied Piper in some ways, just kind of walk the idiots along until the rest of the Eternals, Fastus probably in particular, can bring them up to the point where they are a rational scientific community, where they look at only the natural law and cause and effect, and now have become evolved and intelligent enough to realize that, all Sprite stories are fake. Now we're going to put all of our faith in scientific naturalism and then move from there. And that's another one of the weird points in the story, is that Fastus is the guy that disengages and goes and finds his humanity when he should really be leading the charge, since everybody is using, his gift in order to interpret the world at the point where we see the story really kick off at the museum. Now, one of the other things that you see within that is that kind of goes hand in hand with this is that when Cersei is walking into her discussion where she goes and meets with Dane's already teaching the class, you've got images of Darwin all over the place. Mm-hmm. And whether you believe in evolution or not, micro, macro, none of those things really enter into this discussion as much as this is another spot where that naturalistic worldview comes into play. Whether you fully believe in, the origin of a species, or whether you just look at Darwin's explanations as another way to eliminate a benevolent creator from the equation, that's something that is a common thread through this entire movie. And again, even in that classroom, one of the very first things that they're doing is they're trying to teach kids about the foolishness of not believing in the scientific or the naturalistic laws. And so Sprite from the beginning is doing that in order to try to lead the foolish people in one direction so that they can, quote unquote, get the real work done, in order that, the people that need to be able to help and produce society to be able to prove intelligent life, so that, and we see in the long run, that is what the celestial that's at the core of the earth, that's what he needs. He needs an intelligent life to be able to come to such a great level and to, subdue the earth to a point where he can feed off of all of it. And whenever that happens, that's the entire job of the Eternals. So she leads the fools away so that everybody else can do their job and work in that realm. I hated that they didn't dive more into it. As much as I say that on the one hand, I do hate that they didn't dive more into it, because Gilgamesh has a great story. And if you're a parent that is watching this with, your son or daughter, it's an incredible opportunity for you to talk about Gilgamesh and then to introduce the biblical narrative to him. Mm-hmm. Say, okay, well, the fact that Gilgamesh exists, some people will say, well, this is evidence that the Bible story is not unique. But really what it is it's evidence that the Bible story is probably pretty accurate, because there are other cultures that, even though they've branched off, they know that there was a worldwide flood, that something incredible happened, that Gilgamesh was a hero and is part of this folklore because they got the story and they took it, and it's like a game of telephone, that over the retellings, they got it a little wrong, but they've got some elements in it that are true to the biblical narrative, that throughout history, we've seen these people that are pointing back to these truthful, honest biblical stories. And so when you don't develop a character like Gilgamesh, you kind of rob some of the conversations that can be had outside of that. The same thing with Athena and the way that she morphed over the years, that there are ways that you can bring that back and talk about the idea of a warrior goddess really does speak to the heart and the soul of so many people, because as J. Warner Wallace points out, that is one of the markers of why we identify Christ as the Messiah, is because there is a promise that he's coming back, with the eyes full of fire and on a white horse with robe dipped in blood. It's like, that's an amazing image, and it's very fierce, but very cool. And, Athena plays a role in us being able to have those kind of conversations. And when you lack that character development, it stops so much of what can happen outside of the movie, and the conversations quit being about the characters and just start being about the faults. So those are just some of the things that when you look at the larger worldview that's extrapolated out, just some of the huge misses for the Eternals for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I hope Eternals ends with Arishem choosing to delay his judgment of Earth until he's had a chance to review the memories of Cersei and Phastos and Kingo to determine if humanity is worthy of survival. Going forward in the MCU, will Arishem find anything worth saving?
Who knows? This felt like, to me, this was just another, and I hate to just be such a huge critic of this, because like I said before, I really wanted to love this movie. It just feels lazy. It goes back again. I know that I've been harping on worldview, but that's what it goes back to. The Kingo didn't want Earth to be saved, or didn't feel like Earth needed to be saved, but he was a character who pulled himself out of it. He said, you know what, I'm going to take a step back. I'm not even going to worry about this. You guys do whatever you want. I got Bollywood dance scenes to film, so I'm just going to go live it up. So I don't know whether or not they will, but I think ultimately what that comes back to is for us to ask the question whether or not there is anything in humanity that is worth saving. And that, if you look at the way that the worldview has been extrapolated in this film, comes back to, do you feel like within your realm of truth that there is something worth saving in the world? And obviously, if you don't believe in a creator, if you believe that the world is all machines, the story itself gives us no reason why humanity is worth saving, other than some of the group felt that it was wrong. There's no reasons why they felt that it was wrong. There wasn't an incredible value of life. There's no strong connection that they have to humanity that makes it that, humanity is such a unique creation, that the people are so wonderful, that, there's such a heart and soul in people that, they've seen over time. There's nothing in the story that really compels us that humanity is worth saving. And so Arishem's got other things to do. Right. They prevented a Celestial from being born. And what it feels like more and more is that Arishem's got, more important fish to fry right now. He's got other worlds that are filled with Eternals that are just carbon copies of whatever these bots are. So he's going to go and check it out. And I'm sure whenever he reviews the memories, that what it's basically going to boil down to is the same thing that the entire movie did. And that is, you have to make a moralistic judgment based on how you are feeling at this moment. And that, becomes the truth in the moment. And so however you feel, your thoughts, your feelings, your behaviors actually define whether or not something's good or bad. That there is no real moral law, that there's nothing that we're actually subject to that tells us what the good or what the difference is between good and bad. And so whatever you feel like is going to be the best. And maybe there is, maybe there isn't. But with the coming of Blade and the Black Knight, it's starting to feel a little bit more like humans being turned over to the dark side. So who knows?
It feels like this movie completely broke all of the rules that have sort of become a part of these major epic stories and movies, like what we experience in Star Wars and some of the other things. This hero's journey, there's a clear hero. You understand who he is, where he's coming from. He's then thrust into this bigger universe. And then he's forced to deal with good and evil and all of those things. And in this story, it feels like all of that was lost.
Yeah, it really does. And the part that, the pastor in me hates that, because there are so many incredible hero stories in the Bible, which is just evidence that is something that's written on our heart. You have King Saul in the beginning, who hides behind a cart whenever Samuel's trying to make him king. Like the complete and reluctant hero that he's a head taller than everybody, but he's going to go hide behind a cart. You've got King David, who's the smallest of all the brothers, and yet defeats the giants. And then you've got all of David's mighty men who become these heroes. And even the story of Jesus as this carpenter who, when he goes back to his hometown, the people don't believe in him. He's talking about the transcendent truths of God. And they're like, well, this was the guy that made my table. What does he know? Get him out of the city. And so there's all of these really incredible pieces in the biblical narrative about the hero story. And when we see characters like Thor, that even if you explain him as an alien, great, but he's got this conflict with his family, which a lot of us can relate to. There's struggles with brothers, and you've got two sons. I'm the oldest of four, but I love my siblings. We've got great relationships, but there have been times when, I wanted to take a hammer to him if that was available to me. So there's all these things within the characters that keep them interesting. And not only did the Eternals not have that, but now you have to address this completely different thing. And this is, we're talking about the pastor's heart, is as a parent or as a pastor, as a youth pastor, whenever you're talking to your students about the Eternals, it gives you a strange opportunity that none of the other ones did, in the way that the worldview was created, and starting with, like you said, with the creator. And in breaking that down, this opens up an opportunity for conversations that some of the other Marvel movies really didn't. And it's starting with that, do you believe, obviously Arishem created the earth and it was the seed for this new celestial that was going to come out of it. But that's not what we believe. We believe in a benevolent creator, which was something that was in the original comics, which they wrote out for this movie. Why do you think they did that? And start to interrogate some of those ideas. When you look at the characters, they're all together and they have been for thousands of years, and yet they don't agree. How did they handle conflict? But then, how do they determine right and wrong? If they're just machines and they were created for this purpose, how do they determine right and wrong versus how do we determine right and wrong? And the necessity of believing in a creator to help us determine what right and wrong is. And then when we look at the last part, humanity was a bystander in the entire story. They were easily manipulated by Sprite. Then they were mentally manipulated by Druig. And then in the end, you had all of these other forces that were fighting for them and against them that they didn't know anything about. And people were kind of aimlessly and just kind of aloofly living their lives while the world was being destroyed. And they're just kind of haphazardly covering it over news. But there's no real redemption arc for the characters or the people. Well, one of the great hopes that we have is that there is this opportunity for redemption. And what do we believe redemption is? How do we believe that, a person can be redeemed? And it's only through, Paul says, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, that you can be saved. Well, there's your redemption piece and your redemption element. And this is a story that really doesn't have that. And so when you're talking about a critique of the movie, especially with kids, you can look at each and every one of those things and relate them back to the biblical narrative and show why this doesn't speak to so many people and why it's got such a horrible Rotten Tomato scores, because we know that God has created this beautiful story of our lives, and that every piece of that is imprinted on us. We realize that there's sin in the world. We realize that there's bad in the world, but we also know that there's this opportunity for redemption because we have a God that created us and loved us. And the reason that this movie doesn't speak to so many people is because it doesn't have any of those elements. And if you start to call those things out, you can really bring this around to having a really great, not just gospel-centered conversation, but a conversation about what it means to be a believer, what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be a person of faith, and open up the door to have some opportunities with people who are outside of faith about what that means and what that looks like. And that's been one of the fun things for me is, I've been talking to some of my friends who are agnostic and are atheists that don't understand why they don't connect with this movie because it hits on so many of the points that they believe, but it just feels, one guy in particular, he goes, it was just placid. And I was like, well, the reason is because your heart wants more because that's how you're created. You're an image bearer of God, not a robot that was created in order to, fulfill some destiny in order to, feed a celestial so that he could go and create more robots and, feed the next celestial. Your heart wants there to be more meaning to life. And in this movie, there was no purpose for humanity, but in the story that's written on our hearts, because we were created by a loving God, we have a purpose. And part of our purpose is not just to worship God and to love him, but the part of the purpose is for us to be here for each other, to have conversations like you and I are having, to encourage one another and lift one another up. And the Eternals was completely void of all of that because even in the group, you have one or two who are working together. You've got Gilgamesh who goes and who loves Thena, but Phastos completely goes off and does his own thing. Makari makes sure that everything is held solid, and she's got this romance with Druig that's not really visited. Ajax, loves Sprite, but sends Sprite off to go be with somebody else. But there's not this whole continuity. There's these small couples and pockets, but even when they come together, there's not the shared love, admiration, and care that we see. There's no community that's built around the Eternals. It's just a bunch of individual ideals. And when they all go and split in their separate directions, then it leaves humanity in this wake of like, well, I guess we just get to stand by and see what happens. And that's certainly not the world that God created us in, where we can go and talk to our Creator and pray to him and ask for intercession. And he loves us enough to be part of our story. And it's just missing every piece of that. So I don't know. It's weird to think about in that way, but it's certainly something that I think is worth discussing.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's a really interesting ancient poem in the Bible that talks of gods sent to the earth to rule over humanity. Psalm 82 says that these gods failed in their mission. They didn't rule in justice and righteousness, that they were selfish, and they sought to control humanity instead of obey the Almighty God, Yahweh. The Almighty God of the Bible created humanity and loves every member of it. But these lesser deities failed to defend the weak and the fatherless, to rescue the weak and the needy, and deliver them from the hand of the wicked. And this is exactly the opposite of the scenario that plays out in Eternals. Instead, the film presents a distant, unloving, uncaring deity who has no purpose for earth and humanity other than to use it to incubate another god. Meanwhile, the Eternals are presented as the ones who love humanity and are committed to caring for it. And in my opinion, that big difference is the reason why this film doesn't work. It goes against the story written on our souls. I want to give a big thank you to Lucas Pinckard for joining me on this week's interview episode. If you are looking for some of the craziest and most hilarious conversations around, make sure you listen to the Reverend and the Reprobate. Some of the guests on the show have been David Baker from Forged in Fire, legendary sitcom and comic writer Tom Leopold, and New York Times bestselling author Stephen Mansfield. So make sure you check them out at reverendandreprobate.com. And thank you for listening to Tatooine Sons, a pop culture podcast. If you enjoyed this interview, please take a moment to rate and review the show on your podcast app of choice, and make sure you hit that follow or subscribe button on your app so that you get every episode the moment it drops. Our next episode releases on Tuesday. We will be reacting to the first 2 episodes of Hawkeye, and then looking at Kathleen Kennedy's comments about the future of Star Wars. And Dave Filoni gets a little teary-eyed talking Star Wars Rebels. Don't miss it. And make sure you follow Tatooine Sons on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Share this episode with somebody else. That's how you make the show grow. We would truly appreciate it. I think that's going to do it for this Friday's episode. There's only one thing left to say.
May the Force be with you, always.
This party's over.
I like that Wookiee.
Don't get technical with me.
Join, please.